This video is going to cover the development of scales and just talking about what scales are. This was part of a presentation for a class a while back that covered a lot of things about like validation and bias. It would be too much to put in one video. I'm probably going to make other videos out of the other sections, but yeah, this one's just going to talk about what scales are and how they're designed. So as far as just the jargony version of saying what a scale is, it's an instrument that uses a group of items to measure a latent domain, but in plain English, it's a survey that uses a group of questions to measure some unobservable variable. So as far as the going into what each of those terms mean, this domain or latent variable is the unobserved variable that you're interested in. For some examples of some domains that are unmeasurable is things like psychological disorders like depression and things like frailty and comorbidity. It's hard to have like one question asking like 0 to 10, how depressed are you? Because that implies someone really fully understands depression, is able to give that answer of 0 to 10. But what's much more practical is to ask them a bunch of like smaller questions that are more tangible that ultimately measure this latent variable of depression. It's also possible that it is measurable, but it's just not practical. Things like an MRI might not be practical for some study on concussions, where you might not be practical to give all people in the study an MRI. It would be useful to have like some kind of field test that might consist of a questionnaire. So the next thing is an item, which is the actual questions on a questionnaire. It's usually something that's measurable, that's related to this latent domain. So staying with this example of depression, where, again, it wouldn't be practical to ask how depressed are you, 0 to 10, but you might ask, like, how often in the past 10 days have you experienced poor concentration, low mood, loss of interest? And the answers to those more tangible questions might collectively give an indication of how depressed someone is. And each of these individual items has a scale. So an example is this item 1 for this depression scale, little interest or pleasure in doing things. And the scale for that item goes from not at all, 0, to nearly every day, 3. And the nomenclature gets a little fuzzy here because items have scales, but they're also part of a scale, which is weird, but that'll make sense in a second. So there's an example of a 7-item scale where each of these 7 questions is an item. Each of these items has a scale going from 0 to 3, and collectively they are a scale. That this instrument is a scale or an index or whatever, but I guess those are kind of synonymous. And you generally, how these are scored is like you add the columns basically, and you have a total for, I guess, how depressed this person is. Types of scales. We see them everywhere. They're really common in daily life. The Likert type scale is one that you will have probably seen before. It generally goes from disagree to agree, with a neutral option usually. And you can expand it to include like pretty much as many subtle grades of agreement and disagreement as you want, but it can get kind of silly sometimes if you have like 12. And when you're using this Likert type scale, you got to consider things like whether you're going from disagree to agree, like here, where disagree is on the left and agree is on the right. And if you switch that, like agree is on the left and disagree is on the right, people might not be expecting that, and they might the answers they put might not reflect what they meant because they expected agree to be on the left, basically. You got to cover the entire continuum of opinions. That can come into conflict with that last one there, forced choice versus neutral, where here there's a neutral option. Neutral is an opinion. This person might not agree or disagree, and neutral might be the most accurate answer, but it's common to have forced choice where there's no neutral option. They got to ultimately pick agree or disagree. And that can represent information bias in the sense that they might have no opinion and pick agree or disagree at random, and that isn't actually necessarily how they feel. You got to also avoid overlap. That's easier explained with numbers, where it can't go like 1 to 3 and then 3 to 5, because then 3's in both. The polarity of your scale is something to consider. This top one there is unipolar. It's going from like a neutral lack of agreement, don't agree, to extreme agreement. Well, the bipolar one has a neutral option and varying degrees of disagreement on the left and varying degrees of agreement on the right. Dichotomous scales are really common, things like yes, no, true, false. They're really easy to score and very easy to understand. But again, it's forced choice, so it might not capture true variability, these subtle levels of yes and no and maybe and all that. And yeah, that could represent information bias if people are picking at random when they don't see their answer. Slider scales are common with web-based surveys, and it's also neat because if you have enough, like for example that one below goes from 0 to 100, it's almost like a continuous scale at that point. You can analyze it as such. Visual analog scales are neat because, like, let's just say you're like a really little kid that doesn't know how to read, like you can't read, no pain, mild, moderate, and maybe you can't even count, and that's okay because the FACES scale is pretty understandable to most ages, and then that kid can describe the pain they're feeling in a way that they might not have been able to without this visual analog. So as far as developing the scale, you'd start by like finding this domain you're interested in, this latent variable like depression. You'd create items like questions, and you'd test those questions, reduce the number of questions, figure out how you're going to score. And factor analysis is not something I'm going to talk about in this. It's a huge topic that'll probably get its own video eventually. So yeah, I have this like ongoing theme of like Mario that will maybe make some sense as I go through, but it's a bit of a stretch. So your domain is this latent variable you want to evaluate. I guess here, like, there's this shape and combination of shape and colors that we perceive as Mario that is this latent variable that's composed of items, these little blocks. It's a stretch. But yeah, a good domain can't be measured because if it can, then it doesn't need an instrument or a scale to measure it. It's got to be composed of measurable components that have like literature to back it up, and there shouldn't be an existing instrument because if there is, you might as well not create a new one. And that's something from the presentation. As far as creating items, these items are the questions. They should be measurable and collectively estimate this domain. You should probably start with way more items than you need, because then you can basically pick the best ones. And as far as creating items, there's deductive and inductive ways. So deductive item generation is like consulting the literature or experts in a kind of like a top-down process to figure out what would make a good item. Another way to do that is to figure out the demographic you're ultimately going to have take this survey, and consulting them with like focus groups and open-ended questions and stuff to have them generate items and answers and stuff, which is pretty neat because they might have insights that the expert doesn't. And pre-testing is the next big part. So once you have like a large amount of items, you're going to probably do some pre-testing that will involve, I guess, administering this survey to a group, but maybe not in a traditional setting. There's ways you can do it where you're kind of getting more into the headspace of the person taking the test. And yeah, there's tons of benefits to pre-testing. So, for example, a cognitive interview is kind of what I was just describing, where like when someone's answering a question or taking your survey, there's things that they're either consciously or subconsciously thinking about when they come across each question. Things like, I know what the sentence is saying, but what is it ultimately trying to get at? Things like, what do I need to arrive at this answer? Do I need to access some memory, or do I need to think about my opinions? And things like, is my answer an option? And basically, these are things someone thinks about while they're doing the survey, but with a cognitive interview, you're basically having someone just kind of talk out their stream of consciousness, talk out how they're, all of these things that they think about, having them say them out loud, basically. And that lets you find things like figuring out answers that aren't options and maybe adding them as options. If something's too long ago to remember, maybe asking more recently, or kind of making the wording more user-friendly. So reducing the number of items, like I said, you're usually trying to generate way more than you need, and there's lots of methods to reduce the number once you have generated the list. And some of the most common ones are item discrimination index and correlation between items. And yeah, again, factor analysis is not going to come up. It's pretty interesting, but really takes a lot to explain, and that might get its own video. So as far as the item discrimination index, so this is this 7-item scale that I was showing before. And basically you'll notice that each of these questions, if someone's depressed, they're going to answer nearly every day. So each of these questions, a higher score is expected from someone who is depressed. And ultimately you add up their score at the bottom, and you need to do something with that number. It's 14 in this case. So you might have a scale of all the possible totals. So the total in this case was 14. And you might draw a line somewhere, like we did 13 here, where everyone 13 above is depressed and everyone below is likely not depressed. Ultimately, you're going to have to draw that line somewhere. And that makes sense because, like I said, each of these 7 questions, if someone is extremely depressed, they're probably going to put 3 for everything. And that's reflected here, where someone with a very high score is going to be in that likely depressed portion of the scale. So as far as the item discrimination index, it's kind of hard to describe, but just bear with me. Let's just say we had 110 people take this survey, and 10 people had a score above 13 who are likely depressed, and 100 people had a score that is below 13, meaning these 100 people are likely not depressed. So by looking at how these 10 people that are likely depressed answered these questions and those who aren't depressed, we're able to get indications of whether there's problem questions. So for example, if we're doing the item discrimination index on question 13 here, which is, do you often feel isolated, yes or no? And we have, basically we're figuring out, of these 10 people who we determine are likely depressed, how many of them said yes to this? And we would expect all of them to have said yes to this. And of those who are likely not depressed, how many of them said yes to this? We're hoping that no one said yes to it, because if a lot of people who aren't depressed said yes, that would mean it's not a great question. So here we have 9 out of the 10 people who are likely depressed saying yes. That's pretty good. We had 20 people out of the 100 who are likely not depressed who said yes, and that could be an issue, just because that means that this question might not necessarily apply only to depression. It might not be a good question that's good at parsing out who's depressed and who isn't. So the item discrimination index is basically just subtracting these fractions, and you get 0.7, which isn't bad. Higher would be better. An example of a poorer question is a question like, do you procrastinate? 70% of people who we think are depressed, or based on their total score we think are depressed, said yes to this. But also 60% of people who probably aren't depressed, who had a score that indicated they probably aren't depressed, said yes. And that is a very low item discrimination index, meaning that this question isn't asking about depression very effectively, and maybe we should drop it. Inter-item correlation, this is like a correlation matrix between the questions. Basically, this is one of those rare situations where we want high correlation between all of these questions. And the reason for that is, like I was showing, I'll just skip back. Like all of these questions, we want them, like if someone's truly depressed, we want all of these questions to be answered similarly, and in that sense, they will be correlated. Like if someone says yes to question 1, they're likely to have also said yes to question 2, so we want correlation between these things. That's less common in other epidemiology scenarios where it's often bad to have correlation, but this is a time when it's good. We want them all to be correlated. And collinearity is not really an issue. So as far as actually scoring, this is a common way of scoring where each question has a scale of like 0, 1, 2, and 3. And you just add the totals for each column. The 0 column doesn't have a total because it's 0. But each of the other one, they picked 1 on question 1 and 4, so that's 2 1s. So that total is 2. Basically, ultimately, like at the left there, you can see there's often like a dichotomous way of determining like, oh, everyone above this number is depressed, everyone below isn't. That's a common way of doing it. Another way you can do it is averaging. So like here, you can see for question 1 they put 1, for question 2 they put 3. Basically, if you just like take the average of what they put for everything, you can get a number that way. And yeah, that gives a bit of a simpler score actually, because it would be like somewhere between 0 and 3. So that might be easier depending on what you plan to do with it and how you plan to analyze it. And yeah, that's basically it. I'm hoping to make a couple more videos on scales.